Hi, everyone. As Catherine said, my name is Snow, and I'm a master's student in the sustainability program. For these past few months, I've been researching the ecological impacts of artificial intelligence and exploring ways for us to engage with AI that purposefully minimize these impacts. In today's workshop, we will look at the physical infrastructure of AI systems and case studies that reveal the many environmental repercussions of these systems. Tomorrow, in the second workshop in this series, we will explore methods for operating AI on personal devices that reduces our dependency on harmful AI infrastructure. So I want to begin today with a brief primer to the different forms of AI. AI is a very broad term describing a system that stimulates human learning, problem solving, decision making, and comprehension. Machine learning is a subset of AI that includes systems that learn to identify patterns and make decisions through processes of training and validation with large data sets. Generative AI is a machine learning system that generates new original content based on the content that it was trained on. And within generative AI, there are large language models and small language models. And tomorrow we'll speak more about the specific distinctions between these two categories. But for today, it's enough to keep in mind that these are just two types of generative AI. So now I'm going to speak a bit about the different stages in the AI production life cycle. The first stage is data preparation, which includes the processes of collecting and organizing data so that this data can be inputted into a model. And then the second stage is training. This is the process of teaching a machine learning model to recognize patterns within a data set by adjusting weights and biases to minimize some loss function. After that is a fine-tuning stage, which is the process of adapting an AI model to a downstream task. And this stage generally consumes substantially less energy than the training stage, but it also occurs more frequently and across more numerous organizations, so this makes it non-negligible. And finally, there's the inference stage, which is the process whereby a model makes real-time predictions on new data passed in by a user. And importantly, this accounts for about 90% of a modern AI system's total life cycle energy use. And these are often nonlinear pathways, and they're not necessarily always occurring one after the other. For example, a new model can be made by fine-tuning an existing model. So in this next section, I'm going to discuss the physical infrastructure comprising an AI system. So the infographic on the left highlights key minerals that are mined and processed to produce a US data center. The number on the right of each mineral is the percent that the US imports. Many of the minerals used for semiconductors, microchips, and server boards are being imported at rates greater than 70%. And these images on the right are of places where labor and material are extracted for the construction of these data centers. I wanted to place these images side by side with the USGS infographic to highlight that data center construction drives a global reshaping of both landscapes and lives that is rooted in extraction. So this is an image of the Atacama Desert in Chile, which contains one third of the global lithium, which is the largest lithium reserve in the world, and is heavily mined for the production of lithium ion batteries. This mining is directly resisted by the local indigenous communities. This image is of a cobalt mine in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Congo contains 75% of the world's supply of cobalt, another key mineral used to produce lithium ion batteries. These unregulated, militia-controlled mines in the Congo produce widespread human rights abuses, including exposing children working in the mines to toxic water and air. This is of Lake Bauto in Mongolia. This is an artificial lake that is filled with toxic black mud and is a direct product of the adjacent Bayon Obo mines, which contains 70% of the world's rare earth minerals used to build magnets and storage into electronics. About 75,000 liters of acidic water is produced and is produced and 1 ton of radioactive residue just to refine 1 ton of rare earth minerals. This is Chesterfield Station Coal Ash Pond in Virginia. And this is another surface water body that has been contaminated with heavy metals from the upstream Chesterfield power plant. This site, located in Virginia, the state with the largest number of data centers, is important to keep in mind when discussing AI systems, as the immense power necessitated by AI are creating pressure on local power grids to prolong reliance on fossil fuels. The Occoquan Reservoir provides water to 800,000 people, and it runs through William County, where there is a proposal to build the largest data center complex in the world. This proposal was successfully halted back in April through ongoing pressure and legal actions initiated by the local community. So AI infrastructure is frequently obfuscated. It's strategically placed in undisclosed regions with limited visibility. However, this infrastructure is being actively expanded to meet growing demands of AI systems. And thus, it's important that we center these landscapes as well as the people who are living within them in our understanding of AI infrastructure. AI infrastructure is also constantly changing, and it looks different today than what it looked like a few years ago. But it's helpful for us to familiarize ourselves with the basic components of these systems. AI systems require specialized technology called accelerators, which are designed to handle the massive computing demands of AI algorithms. These accelerators can come in a number of different forms, including application-specific integrated circuits, field programmable gate arrays, and graphical processing units, or GPUs. GPUs specifically have played a key role in the production of AI because they are able to conduct multiple computations at the same time, which is extremely useful for processing large-scale data sets. However, GPUs are notorious for requiring large amounts of electricity. This demand for specialized technology has driven AI-specific data centers. A typical AI data center might have well over 10,000 of these GPUs connected into its server racks. And these AI data centers also require constant 24/7 power connected via local power grids. An AI system operating in a data center cannot be turned off. Users expect to be able to use ChatGPT on demand at any time of the day. Data centers are also built with massive uninterruptible power supplies to seamlessly provide instantaneous power in cases of grid disruptions. For example, Google has 100 million battery cells supporting their AI servers. In addition, data centers also are constructed with diesel-fueled generators that provide electricity during extended outages when both grid and battery systems become unavailable. While these generators are only turned on in times of emergency or when tested, when they are used, they emit 200 to 600 times more nitrogen oxides than natural gas plants. As I will speak about in a bit, data centers are often built in clusters. So, in times of grid stress, this can produce short-term spikes in regional pollutants. To dissipate the heat that is produced by the high-density computing equipment, AI data centers are also equipped with robust cooling systems, most commonly being through liquid cooling, as well as with ultra high bandwidth and low latency networking technology to ensure on-demand access to end users. So this chart shows the distribution of a common AI GPU among companies that are producing and deploying large-scale AI systems. 65% of these chips are owned by four companies, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta. Multiple of these companies, such as Meta and Amazon, are also investing in undersea fiber optic cables so that they can control another layer of this AI infrastructure. Additionally, only a small number of companies in the world currently produce the specialized chips used in AI systems, and this is in major part because of the large financial and time investments required to produce new AI chips. It can take up to 10 years to produce these chips from the design phase to the deployment. So these images help highlight the distribution of data centers, with nearly half of the world's data centers being located in the US. And within the US, AI workloads are also highly concentrated in a small number of states, including Virginia, California, Texas, Illinois, and Arizona. So historically, we've seen large data centers constructed where there are four features overlapping. First, there is a presence of robust fiber optic routes and peering points. AI companies need high speed networking for the interconnection of facilities in order to support with computation intensive processing and in order to deliver computation directly to users. The second feature is substation capacity and relatively cheap power. Third is the accessibility of permitting, prioritizing regions that are used to large power dense buildings and where local governments know how to evaluate data center proposals already. And lastly, is the existence of large aggregable land parcels located near metro areas. Altogether, these are locations that appear to be rural, but are actually at highly connected grid points. Prioritizing these four features has resulted in clusters of data centers in Ashburn, Atlanta, Santa Clara, Dallas, Chicago, and Phoenix. As these locations have become more crowded, AI companies have begun to look for new areas to build in, prioritizing proximity to strategies that minimize potable water use, and where there's access to state and local economic incentives, as well as limited pushback from the local community. So now I'm going to speak in more detail about the ecological impacts of this infrastructure. The first study I'm going to highlight is called More Than Carbon, Cradle to Grave Environmental Impacts of Gen AI Training on the NVIDIA AI A100 GPU. This study provided a life cycle assessment of the complete training of two AI models on NVIDIA A100. This GPU was released in 2020 and it revolutionized deep learning efficiency by delivering 2.5 times greater computational power and enhancing memory capacity compared to previous generations of GPUs. As I mentioned, this study analyzed two AI models, the first being Bloom, which involved 1,080,000 GPU hours and was trained in Paris, France. The second AI model studied was GPT-4, which involved 57 million GPU hours and was trained in Iowa. It employed planetary boundary aware normalization to analyze the GPU's per capita impact across 16 criteria spanning the GPU's manufacturing, distribution, usage, and end-of-life stages. Planetary boundary aware normalization expresses impact as a proportion of ecological limits per capita, with consideration for planetary limits. In other words, this analysis indicates the environmental impacts of training an AI model as a proportion of the annual environmental budget per world capita, communicating environmental impact through the equivalence of the global ecological limits at the scale of a single human inhabitant makes large-scale impacts more intuitive and accessible. So this image shows the impact contribution of a single GPU by life cycle across the 16 different categories. The usage stage is the most impactful stage, contributing to 87% of the total impact. The share of impact attributed to the usage stage is particularly high among fossil fuels, particulate matter, and terrestrial eutrophication, reflecting the energy-intensive nature of GPU operations. The manufacturing stage is the second most impactful stage, dominating six categories, including human toxicity at 94%, minerals and metals at minerals and metals use at 85%, impact on freshwater eutrophication at 81% impact. This impact reflects the material extraction and processing activities associated with chip fabrication, which involves intensive uses of metals and chemical substances. And this image shows the results of normalizing the life cycle impact per capita for both the GPT-4 and for the Bloom model. The climate change impact of training GPT-4 is the equivalent of approximately 11,522 people. This high impact can in part be attributed to the location of training, Iowa, where there is a carbon-intensive grid, predominantly relying on fossil fuels for electricity generation. Bloom's climate change impact is the equivalent of approximately 53 people, and this in part can be attributed to being trained in Paris, where there is a low carbon nuclear electricity grid. So before continuing this discussion, I want to note that the evaluation of real world footprint from AI specific data center operations is limited because tech companies do not release these metrics in their environmental impact reports. So this image is taken from a report published earlier this year called The Carbon and Water Footprints of Data Centers and What This Could Mean for Artificial Intelligence, and is based on the most recently released environmental impact reports as of October 19th, 2025. And it highlights how tech companies sometimes share their energy emissions and water footprints of their data centers as a whole, but do not share metrics specific to AI workloads. So now let's speak a bit more about the specific energy implications of these systems. The energy footprint includes the total energy used by a data center. Small and medium data centers require around 15 megawatt hours. Large and hyperscale data centers usually involve 20 to 100 megawatt hours, and AI data centers commonly exceed even the maximum of this range, requiring over 100 megawatt hours. Another important term in looking at energy in this context is power usage effectiveness, which is an industry standard metric of energy efficiency in data centers. It basically helps define what percentage of energy at a data center is being used for the computing equipment as opposed to for overhead such as the cooling. Um, and a high PUE indicates lower energy efficiency. I found that this value is often released by data center owners and is useful for estimating energy footprint. The image on the right highlights the average PUE for each US state, and we can see that states like Florida and Louisiana are particularly energy inefficient. So this is not a comprehensive list, but a few of the factors that influence the energy footprint at an AI system include the design of the AI algorithm being deployed, the number of processors deployed in the system, the power rating of these processors, and the data center's efficiency in delivering power and cooling the processors or the PUE. The length of the processing time, whether that be the time to completely train a model or just the time to complete a single request to the model, also affects the amount of energy that's consumed. So this study is titled Carbon Emissions and Large Language Neural Network Training and was conducted by a group of mostly Google employees looking at the energy consumption of training five large language models. It was published in 2021, and most of the models evaluated were early stage AI models developed by Google and running on Google Cloud. The study also looked at GPT-3 produced by OpenAI and running on Microsoft Azure. Reading this study, there is a sense of higher transparency, which I think is a bit more rare to come across today. In the study, OpenAI shared directly with the Google researchers proprietary information about GPT-3's hardware configuration and performance, which was used in the study to estimate the overall energy consumption. So this research found that GPT-3 in 2020 consumed 1.29 gigawatt hours of energy. Um, and based on data published by NVIDIA about the model's total computational demand and the hardware um, performance data received directly from OpenAI, the research found that training took approximately 14.8 days of continuous computation. Later research shows that the energy consumption of training GPT-4 um, required over 50 gigawatt hours of energy. And for reference, this is about 0.1% of New York City's annual electricity consumption for its 8.48 million residents. This also indicates that training GPT-4 in 2023 required approximately 40 times more energy than training GPT-3 in 2020. And as of last year, GPT-4 has already been retired after less than 2 years of being deployed. So this next study is titled How Hungry is AI? Benchmarking Energy, Water, and Carbon Footprint of LLM Inference. And it includes a case study estimating the 2025 annual energy consumption of GPT-4 inference. To do this, it estimated the model's hardware configuration based on location restrictions, receipts of purchase, and statistical analysis. It also adopted non-GPU power usage as a standard zero point 0.5 utilization and integrated performance metrics such as latency and throughput taken from public APIs. Importantly, it utilized the average power usage effectiveness values published by Microsoft in its calculations. And this image shows the results of this study, which estimates the 2025 annual energy consumption of GPT-4 inference to exceed the total electricity consumption of 35,000 US residential households and to be comparable to the energy use of 325 universities aggregated. The screenshots here are taken from Rooted Future Lab's Data Center Impact Dashboard, which maps the energy reserve margins across the world. This is the amount of energy available in a given electricity service area, and it compares the total capacity of an energy grid to its peak usage. The screenshot on the right is of Fort Meade, Florida, where there is a proposed data center. Um, as shown in the map, as shown in the map, this data center, which would be the largest in the United States, is being proposed in a region where there's already negative energy reserve margins. So in this next section, I will discuss the carbon implications of these AI systems. So just to define a few terms, carbon intensity is a measure of how many grams of carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity. The carbon intensity of electricity used by data centers was 48% higher than the US average. And this is in part because data centers are currently clustered in places that have dirtier grids on average, like the coal-heavy grid in the Mid-Atlantic region that includes Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The emissions factor is the rate at which given a given activity releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and this can be evaluated as either location-based emissions or market-based emissions. Location-based emissions are the greenhouse gas emissions emitted within a specific geographic boundary, such as a country or a grid region, based on where the energy was consumed. And market-based emissions are greenhouse gas emissions emitted by generating sources from which a company purchases electricity. Companies are able to reduce their market-based emissions by carbon-free by via carbon-free energy procurement, while this may not in fact reflect the actual deliverability of that electricity. Last year, Google did release a study measuring the market-based footprint per prompt of their custom AI model, Gemini. Since the engineers conducting the study had access to the AI system, they were able to analyze the energy consumption of individual components within the system, including active accelerators, CPU, DRAM, idle computers, cooling technology, and power conversion equipment. This resulted in a highly accurate assessment of real-time hardware utilization. However, I've chosen not to present the findings of this study as it focuses on the market-based emissions, which for a large company like Google with access to massive capital, misrepresent the impacts of their systems in practice. For example, the table here shown here is taken from another Google study released in 2025 and highlights the large gaps between the market-based and location-based carbon emissions of multiple versions of Google hardware, in which the location-based emissions are consistently over twice as much as the market-based emissions. The study that I mentioned earlier, measuring the energy footprint of GPT-4 inference, also assessed the carbon footprint of GPT-4 inference. Knowing that GPT-4 is hosted on Microsoft Azure, the study calculated the emissions by multiplying the calculated energy per query by Microsoft's published carbon intensity factor and scaling the result to the estimated queries processed per year. And this image shows the estimated 2025 annual carbon footprint of GPT-4 inference, which is comparable to the annual emissions of 30,000 gasoline-powered cars and 2,300 flights. So these data center emissions can be categorized into three groups that describe the full life cycle of AI hardware. Scope 1 emissions include the direct emissions from electricity sources owned by the AI company. Um, and so this includes HVAC and on-site generation. Scope 2 includes indirect emissions from purchased electricity, including the emissions from off-site power needed for the model training, fine-tuning, and inference. And scope 3 includes all other emissions associated with the AI company, including hardware, manufacturing, and transportation, as well as data center building construction. So now let's take a look at another case study. Northern Virginia contains 631 data centers, which is the highest number of all US states. And Virginia's grid, as shown through this screenshot on the left, is primarily natural gas, nuclear, and coal. These screenshots are taken again from the data center impact dashboard, this time displaying data center carbon footprint. This metric accounts for both direct and um, indirect emissions from both on-site generators and from the grid producing the electricity generation. And as shown by the map, the data center carbon footprint is over 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year in the northern region of Virginia, with the highest concentration, where there's the highest concentration of data centers. And this map shows the locations in 2025 carbon dioxide equivalent emissions of the power plants in the region with the high concentration of data centers. There's also a higher concentration of power plants with emissions greater than 10 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Another study looked at the public health impacts of Scope 1 emissions in Northern Virginia. This study assumed a reference case in which the actual emissions are 10% of the 2024 permitted levels, which is modeled after both the historic trends and potential future demand use. Under this case, the study found that air pollutants from just Scope 1 data center emissions alone in Northern Virginia um, in, um, in, found that the air pollutants released include fine particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and could contribute to approximately 14,000 asthma cases and 13 to 19 premature deaths each year. Again, that's just coming from the northern region of Virginia, and is only the Scope 1 emissions. According to the study, these impacts correspond to an estimated public health burden of 220 to $300 million across the US. The map on the left shows the Scope 1 per household costs from the data center backup generators in Virginia, with the green star marking Loudoun County, which has the largest concentration of data centers. And then this table on the right lists the top 10 counties by the per household health costs from Virginia data center Scope 1 emissions. And the data displayed on this table suggests that the elevated health impacts can occur not only in the communities that host these data centers, but also in communities that are downwind due to long-range transport of pollutants. So in this next part, I will discuss the impacts of AI systems on water. So water footprint um, is the total water usage of a data center, and this includes both indirect and direct usage. Water withdrawal is the total volume of water that is removed from surface water, groundwater, or municipal sources for data center operation. And water consumption is the portion of the withdrawn water that is not returned to the local watershed, primarily due to evaporative cooling losses. Finally, water usage effectiveness, like power usage effectiveness, is a industry standard metric quantifying the amount of water used per kilowatt hour of IT energy consumption. As with power water effectiveness, or as with power usage effectiveness, water usage effectiveness is an important metric for estimating water footprints of data centers because it's also commonly published by the data center owners. Direct water footprint is the on-site water used for data center cooling. It represents approximately 25% of the water footprint of data centers. AI data centers frequently implement liquid cooling systems as opposed to the air cooling systems traditionally used with traditional data centers. Depending on the weather conditions and operational settings, data centers evaporate water at approximately 1 to 9 liters per kilowatt hour of server energy. And then we have indirect water footprint, which includes the offsite water for electricity generation. This represents approximately 66% of the water footprint of data centers. And tech companies do not generally disclose this metric as they do not see it as a direct consequence of their technologies and generally claim the impact as beyond their control. The average water withdrawal rate for electricity generation is 43.8 liters per kilowatt hour, and the average water consumption rate for electricity generation is 3.1 liters per kilowatt hour. This means that for every kilowatt hour of electricity generated, on average, 3.1 liters of water are consumed by the power system. The embodied water footprint is the water used in the supply chain for server manufacturing. And this accounts for approximately 10% of the water footprint of data centers, varying based on the water recycling rates at the manufacturing plants. So, for example, the national averages for Singapore's semiconductor plants and wafer plants are 23% and 45%, respectively. Another study called Making AI Less Thirsty, Uncovering and Addressing the Secret Water Footprint of AI Models estimated the total operational water footprint of GPT-3. It calculated on-site water usage by using location-specific power usage effectiveness and water usage effectiveness values that were published by Microsoft across all Microsoft data center locations. Analyzing all data center locations was necessary because the precise location of GPT-3 training is not public. So the study also compared offsite water usage using grid-specific electricity water intensity factors published by the Resources Institute across all of the Microsoft data center locations. And the results of this study estimated that training GPT-3 consumes an average of 5.4 million liters of fresh water, and that GPT-3 inference requires approximately 500 milliliters for each 10 to 50 responses. This study, which looked at the footprints across different Microsoft data centers, also highlights the impacts of data center location on water consumption. So, for example, a Virginia data center located within a grid dominated by natural gas, resulted in a total of 3.7 million liters for training GPT-3, whereas Washington, located in a grid dominated by hydropower, will consume 15.3 million liters of water for training the same model. Um, and so a few other factors besides the geographic location that influence water consumption include the capacity of the site to recirculate water and the efficiency of the servers used at the data center. So the same study that I have been mentioning that benchmarked the 2025 energy and carbon footprints of GPT-4 inference also examined the annual water footprint of the model. It calculated the direct water usage using published on-site WUE values, supplementing any missing values with national averages. The study also calculated indirect usage of indirect water usage using the national average of WUE for power generation. So as shown in this chart, the study estimated that the annual water consumption of GPT-4 inference is comparable to the annual drinking needs of 1.2 million people. This consumption represents the fresh water evaporated and permanently removed from the local ecosystems due to GPT-4 inference in the year 2025. The next case study that I will highlight is Phoenix, Arizona, which is becoming a hub for data center construction due to tax incentives, its low disaster risk, and its strong fiber network infrastructure. These screenshots highlight a few of the hyperscale data centers that either already exist or are being proposed in Phoenix. The scale of land and power that are being utilized by each of these sites implies that they are hosting AI systems. And this map's taken again from the data center impact dashboard, shows the baseline water stress in Phoenix. Baseline water stress measures the ratio of total water demand, domestic, industrial, irrigation, and livestock to available renewable surface and groundwater supplies. As we can see in the on the image in the right, the image on the left, Phoenix faces the highest level baseline water stress. And the aqueduct water risk is a more comprehensive assessment of water-related risks evaluated at the watershed level. It aggregates 16 different risk factors covering physical quantity and quality risks, as well as regulatory and reputational risks. As shown in the map, Phoenix also experiences a very high aqueduct water risk. And these maps show the data center water impact, um, which accounts for the water consumption at data center facilities, both direct and indirect, relative to the water scarcity at each watershed. The high data center water impact in Phoenix, an area that we have already seen faces high water stress, is representative of a greater trend whereby two-thirds of data centers are being built or are data centers built or developed since the year 2022 have been located in water-stressed regions. I also want to highlight some of the prominent wastewater impacts of AI systems beyond consumption. Some of the common wastewater contaminants include heavy metals, biocides, and corrosion inhibitors. Heavy metals such as copper, zinc, and lead enter the wastewater in trace amounts when metal components degrade. Biocides are chemicals added to cooling systems used to prevent the growth of bacteria, mold, and algae, and corrosion inhibitors are chemicals in cooling systems that are used to prevent corrosion. The biocides and corrosion inhibitors of cooling systems can include PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, which are highly persistent pollutants that accumulate in the environment as well as the body when consumed, posing serious harm to long-term ecological and human health. A study by the Environmental and Energy Study Institute has shown that expansion of AI data centers has driven expansion in PFAS material manufacturing that has already been linked to widespread drinking water contamination. And in this next section, I want to share a bit of research comparing the energy, carbon, and water footprints across different AI models. So this study that I have previously been mentioning that estimated the energy, carbon, and water footprints of GPT for inference also quantified the query level operational footprint of inference across 30 different models. It achieved these estimations by applying national averages for models hosted on cloud providers that do not publicly disclose the carbon impact factor of these facilities. Based on this study, the overall most energy efficient model is GPT 4.1 nano, which consumes about zero point 0.1 watt hour for an average length prompt query. For reference, a typical Google search consumes about zero point 0.3 watt hours. DeepSeek R1 is the most energy intensive, consuming about 29 watt hours per prompt query. Um, and that's about 107 times more than Nano. This study also compared the models with both short and long, lengthy query prompts, highlighting how model performance can vary based on input. For example, while DeepSeek R1 was the most energy consumptive model for an average prompt, GPT-03 consumed the most for a long prompt. The study also compared the water and carbon impacts of the 30 models examined, the most resource efficient systems, which include GPT 4.1 Nano, Llama 3.21b, and Llama 3.23b, all maintain carbon emissions below zero point 0.3 grams per query and use less than 2 milliliters of water across all input lengths. By contrast, one of the least efficient models, DeepSeek R1, consistently emits over 14 grams of carbon dioxide and consumes more than 150 milliliters of water per query, which is equivalent to driving 50 meters in a gasoline-powered car and using 2/3 of a standard cup of water. So before I wrap up, I just want to mention a few more impacts of AI data centers not covered in depth through my research. One of the major impacts of data centers, very commonly vocalized by the local community, is noise pollution. The on-site diesel generators, large building HVAC systems, and server cooling systems at data centers produce 24/7 noise, including sounds that are both audible and inaudible to human hearing. The audible sounds can be detected as a continuous pitch, while a pitch, whine, or drone for miles outside of the data center. The inaudible sounds, infrasound and ultrasonic, are disruptive to many other animals, such as cows that have wider hearing ranges than humans. Both the audible and inaudible frequencies are linked to increased stress, anxiety, cognitive impairments, and sleeping disorders in the communities adjacent to data centers. However, traditional noise ordinances typically rely on decibel monitoring and are not designed to adequately monitor and regulate the impacts of low frequency sounds on public health. The large quantities of lithium ion batteries, fuel storage for emergency generators, and high computing equipment at data centers pose significant fire risks, which is another hazard to the surrounding community. The always-on nature of these data centers make it so that fires easily cascade across the interconnected systems. And finally, expansion of AI data centers produce massive e-waste as AI hardware tends to have short commercial life cycles. GPUs and servers are generally replaced every 2 to 5 years, commonly before becoming obsolete as newer models become available. Recent research estimates that by 2030, AI data centers will generate anywhere between zero point 0.4 to 2.5 million tons of annual e-waste. This would be equivalent to discarding 2.1 to 13.3 billion units of iPhone 15 Pros in the year 2030. However, this research also shows that circular economy strategies along the AI value chain has the potential to reduce e-waste by 16 to up to 86%. Before I wrap up, I want to list a few more areas of additional work I think are important based on my research. One of these areas involves integrating analysis of model accuracy into environmental impact assessments. I saw this done in a study that focused on small language models, which I will discuss in tomorrow's session, but it would be interesting to see this analysis implemented for the larger, more consumptive models as well. You may have noticed also that among many of the studies that I mentioned, it is common to use national averages to approximate the impact of AI on water and energy resources. These estimates are necessary because the locations of where models are deployed aren't always made public. And um, in order to accurately understand the real impact of AI systems on local environments in which they are actually situated, it is necessary that we build policy that mandates companies to release data about the locations hosting their AI systems and the scale of workloads so that there can be accurate third-party assessments. In addition to data transparency, it is essential that we pressure legislators to regulate construction of AI data centers and ensure ongoing community oversight over these systems even after construction completes. Earlier this month, New York state lawmakers did pass a bill imposing a moratorium on AI data centers that will last 1 year and applies to data centers over 20 megawatts. This legislature also requires companies to help cover the costs of connecting to the grid and increased the renewable energy requirements for both small and large data centers. So I thought it would be good to just end on that as a positive note of progress in a good direction. This is a list of some of the studies that I specifically mentioned in this presentation for later reference. And that's it for my presentation today. I have also worked on a one-pager that I believe Catherine will be sharing in the chat, and it will also be available throughout the City College campus in the fall. The recordings for this workshop today will also be made available. And I just want to thank everyone for joining. As Catherine said, my name is Snow. For the past few months, I've been conducting this research on the ecological impacts of AI, as well as options for engaging with AI as students and faculty who want to minimize these impacts. In today's session, I will share what I've been learning about working with AI locally and how we can disinvest from the harmful AI infrastructure that we talked about in depth during yesterday's workshop. The goal is to leave today with just some basic knowledge of how of the tools that can help facilitate more purposeful engagement and experimentation with artificial intelligence. So, just to get us started here, this diagram provides basic summarization of the infrastructure comprising an AI system, not including the end-of-life flows. When engaging with AI as student and faculty, it's important to recognize that Most of us are working at the application layer, which is the yellow box in this diagram, and this exists as basically a finished product within a much more complex system. And in order to build more sustainable AI systems, we need interventions within each component of this diagram. However, with that in mind and with that framing, there are still some t tangible interventions that we can take as people who want to minimize our impact, and that's going to be the focus of today. So for those of you who were not able to join yesterday, I'm going to repeat this basic primer on different forms of AI. AI is an umbrella term used to describe a system that simulates human learning, problem solving, decision making, and comprehension. Machine learning is a subset of AI. It is a system that learns to identify patterns and make decisions through processes of training and validation with large data sets. And then within machine learning, you have generative AI, which is a system that generates new original content based on the content that it was trained on. So there are many forms of generative AI, including large language models, and small language models, and we're going to talk a bit more about those in detail today. And some other important terminology that will help us today. Again, for those who joined yesterday, this might be a bit of a repeat, but still wanted to introduce it today. Model training is the process of teaching a machine learning model to recognize patterns within a data set by adjusting weights and biases to minimize a loss function. Model inference is the process whereby a model makes real-time predictions on new data in response to user input. And as the typical end users of AI, we are engaging with models that are performing inference. And as mentioned yesterday, it's important to keep in mind that model inference accounts for about 90% of a modern AI model's total life cycle energy consumption. Model parameters are variables whose values are adjusted while training a model to establish how input data is transformed into a desired output. You can think of the parameters kind of like the settings that a model uses to make its predictions. And a larger number of model parameters means that the overall size of that model is going to be larger. And lastly, broadly speaking, when the term resource-constrained device is used, we're referring to devices with limited compute storage, memory, um, and power, and that are able to execute with minimal power. So returning to the idea of large language models versus small language models, large language models are what are more widely known. Some of the common LLMs include GPT, Claude, and Gemini. As per their name, they are large. They involve over 10 billion parameters. For example, GPT-4 has 1 trillion parameters. The common small language models, or SLMs, include Llama, Phi, Qwen, and Gemma. Um, some of these models, such as Llama, also have versions that are classified as large language models. So these aren't exclusive um, groupings. SLMs are designed so that they have lightweight architecture that involves fewer computational resources than LLMs. They involve from millions up to a few billion parameters and are commonly produced by implementing techniques that substantially reduce the model size. So I'm just going to walk through a few of with a few of these different techniques. Model distillation is a technique that involves transferring knowledge from a large model into a smaller one, and this captures the core capabilities of the larger model without including the full complexity of that model. Model pruning involves reducing model size by removing parameters that have minimal impact on the outputs of the model. And quantization is a process of shrinking the model size by representing the weights and activations of the model with lower precision data types. So the process of training large language models involves massive, broadly scraped data sets, such as the entire public internet in the case of GPT. The process of cleaning and training models with this magnitude of data takes from weeks to months of continuous computation to complete. For example, training GPT-4 required an estimated 90 to 100 days to train. In contrast, SLMs are trained on smaller and commonly and more specialized data sets. These models take from hours up to a few days to train. And this means that the process of training new SLMs will require significantly fewer resources than training an LLM. So the massive data sets used for LLM training results in more accurate responses for requests with a broad context. For example, LLMs are able to summarize large documents or retain knowledge across a long chat conversation. Whereas the fine-tuning of SLMs can lead to more accurate responses for requests with specific domains. For example, a SLM might be trained specifically on legal or health context or only from data from textbooks. However, recent research is showing that rising SLMs such as Llama 3.18b and Gemma 2.9b are outperforming LLMs on some of the common industry benchmarks. Either way, it's important to keep in mind that when we are working with either of these tools, LLMs or SLMs, we always should be applying our own critical thinking to evaluating the outputs rather than just copying the output as at face value. So the energy consumption of inference depends on the hardware that's hosting the model. In order to be usable, LLMs must be deployed on highly specialized hardware that is optimized for an AI workloads and that are designed specifically to boost performance, reduce latency, and enhance efficiency. And again, that's just because of the size of these models. Due to this, um, oh, Due to their smaller size, SLMs are able to run on a wider range of hardware. Um, if deployed on specialized hardware, SLMs can outperform LLMs, providing very low latency and efficient responses. However, generally, SLMs are deployed on more generic general purpose processors, which can result in longer runtimes for processing requests and lead to lower energy efficiency. So I think that this is a good point to pause and discuss the rebound effect as it relates to AI. So here's how the rebound effect works. Rebound starts with a demand for more efficient AI systems. Companies are motivated to reduce the resources expended for processing requests as the number of requests for their system increases. The demand for efficient AI systems that quickly that responds quickly to requests drives um, these these data to these data companies to scale their computing infrastructure. This means increasing the number and concentration of their server racks and networking equipment at a given site, and as a result, ramping up the cooling systems at that site. More computing power enables larger data sets to be used in model training and faster response times during model inference. Um, However, more efficient AI systems, which demand a greater investment of um, water and energy, generate a greater demand as they widen accessibility and ease of the technology. AI firms turn to the largest cloud computing providers, known as hyperscalers, who already have access to the immense financial capital um, needed for the construction of massive AI data centers. So many times these hyperscalers are also making major investments into the development of AI firms' products. For example, AI firm Anthropic has a major partnership with the Amazon Web Services. So, in other words, the hyperscalers' capital is what's driving AI production, which in turn necessitates further data center construction, which enables expanded AI production, all the while demanding greater resource usage and expanding the system's environmental impact. This all started with just a demand for more efficiency within AI, and it also highlights the importance of thinking about sustainability beyond energy efficiency. So this brings me to our discussion on working with local language models. These are models that can be installed and run locally on personal hardware, such as a laptop or a phone, rather than through using external cloud services. This means that sending queries to the model does not require making requests to data centers. These models are generally smaller, with size limitations dependent on the local hardware running the model. Again, I want to highlight quantization, which I mentioned briefly earlier. This technique, which reduces the computational and memory costs of running inference, is a technique that is commonly used in building local language models. So one of the primary benefits of local language models is to reduce our dependency on the highly extractive and polluting infrastructure of hyperscale data centers, which I discussed in yesterday's session. Working with local language models also has the benefit of widening access to AI technology. Anyone who has access to a laptop or even a mobile device can experiment with running language models locally, whereas models running on the cloud are frequently placed behind paywalls. And local language models also ensures data privacy as data input into the system remains on the local device. So this study, called Optimizing Large Language Models, Metrics, Energy Efficiency, and Case Study Insights, analyzed the impacts of local inference and the process of quantization on carbon footprint. The researchers selected pre-trained LLMs that are specifically designed for low computational overhead, such as Llama and Qwen. They measured the precision, recall, and F1 score of the models before and after quantization. They also measured the energy usage and estimated carbon footprints by monitoring power consumption of local hardware and utilizing emission factor emission factor data. This study found that quantization reduced energy consumption and emissions of model inference by up to 50%, 55%. And also that quantization can be widely adopted without compromising performance. However, the researchers did note in their conclusions that conducting this study, um, that in conducting this study, devices with limited processing capabilities could experience delays in real-time applications, which could potentially undermine the energy efficiency gained through quantization. And that just relates to the trade-off that I was talking about before with energy efficiency when running models on more constrained hardware. This it also highlights the importance of selecting models that are suited to the hardware constraints of a device, which I'll speak a bit more about in a later slide. So now I'm going to walk through the basic steps and tools I use for running local language models. If you would like to follow along and have questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat, and Catherine will let me know. So the first step is to install software that can be used with the AI, to interface with the AI system. We need a platform that will do four basic things: browse models, download models, select models, and input prompts to allow us to input prompts to the model. So the first option that I've been working with is LM Studio. This is a desktop application that offers a simple interface and easy installation. I have found that this software is the most frictionless experience in terms of running local AI inference, and I recommend it for anyone who doesn't have a coding background and just wants to get started with exploring local AI. Another tool that I've tried out is Unsloth Studio, which runs through a browser session. In addition to offering local model inference, this tool allows users to fine-tune and train models. The user interface for Unsloth Studio is very similar to LM Studio. So while my presentation today focuses on LM Studio, the process translates almost directly into Unsloth Studio.
Um,
The next step, hi, and Jeanette, did you mean to unmute yourself?
Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay. Um, the next step is to choose the AI model we want to experiment with. As I mentioned earlier, it's important to select our model based on our device's constraints. So a device with low RAM or system memory, or that has no dedicated GPU, should work with models that have less than 3 billion parameters. A device with moderate RAM and a basic GPU capacity should use models that have less than 7 billion parameters. And a device with high RAM and a powerful GPU can use models with 13 billion parameters or less. So on a Mac, you can find these specs, these system specifications through clicking on the Apple icon in the upper left and selecting the About This Mac. This will show you the image on the left here, which showcases the device's memory. To see the device's GPUs, you can click on the More Info button and then select System Report, which will bring up the image on the right, which lists the GPUs. As shown in these images, my MacBook Pro has a standard M3 GPU and 18 gigabytes of RAM. I tend to have simultaneous applications open almost at all times on my laptop, and they each utilize memory, so I treat my actual RAM as lower than this 18 gigabytes. So I found that working with models that have that have over 7 billion parameters tend to cause my machine to lag, while working with models that have fewer than 5 billion parameters tend to work fine. So LM Studio allows you to browse models directly in the app. You can search for these models by the name or the creator, or just look at the most liked and most downloaded models. For each model, there's a description of the model, the number of downloads, the number of likes, time since last updated, and download options, along with a whole lot of other things that are not necessarily relevant for just getting started with these models. There is often an option also to download the quantized version of the model, which is denoted by a Q in the drop-down option, in the drop-down download options. And I highly recommend selecting the quantized option when it's available. So most model names will be formatted with the model base name plus a number plus the letter B. The number indicates how many billion parameters are in the model. So the model Llama 3.23b has a base name of Llama, a version of 3.2, and 3 billion parameters. Hugging Face is another tool that can be used for browsing models. It allows you to filter models by the number of parameters, which I find very helpful for um, searching for popular small language models. Hugging Face also offers a bit more in-depth detail on each model than what you'll find in LM Studio, although I usually find what's in LM Studio to be sufficient. Hugging Face also has a community forum where people can ask questions to each other about these models. So after we've chosen our model and downloaded it, the next step will be to load the model into our software. This is easy to do in both LM Studio and Unsloth Studio. This image shows the interface of a new chat session in LM Studio. From this view, there will be a drop down which lists the models that you currently have locally downloaded. And from this drop down, you just select the model that you want to load into the current chat session. And then the final step in this process is just to experiment with the models through a chat session. When I start using a model, I typically will ask it a few questions um, on a topic that I already have some knowledge around. And I do this so that I can assess the accuracy of these responses as well as the style and the format of the responses alongside my baseline knowledge of the topics. Each of these models have their own kind of distinct format of outputting the information. So it's also a matter of just finding what your preferences are in terms of how you want the information to be conveyed. Um, in LM Studio, the chat sessions are also automatically named and saved and can be referenced at later times. And I like using these chats kind of like a log of my research. I find this really helpful because it allows me to track a process. It's kind of similar to if I were to be able to view my path of browsing the internet and what my takeaways are at each step. And I just appreciate that you're able to kind of return to these sessions and read over them again. Um, and yeah, I usually create like a different chat for each topic that I'm researching, and then I'll delete them as I no longer need them. So that's the full process of working with local language models. A goal of these workshops, again, is to support more purposeful engagement with AI, that considers the widespread environmental repercussions of AI. And I think one of the dominant ways that many people are working kind of passively with AI is through the Google Chrome browser. So, before I wrap up today's workshop, I also wanted to mention some other options for browsers that are not using AI. So Google has integrated their custom AI model, Gemini, into the back end of Google Chrome. While there are ways to hide the AI overview from from our view, there are not ways to fully remove AI from the Google Chrome browser altogether. This means that for every request made to Google, the carbon footprint will include both the that of a traditional search plus that of a request to Gemini, as well as the embodied footprint of training Gemini. So by learning to work with these alternative browsers, we can become more deliberate on our AI usage, as opposed to just embracing it as the default option at all times. So these are three options that I know of for browsers that do not like force a usage of AI. Vivaldi is the um, my default browser that I work with. Waterfox is an open source version of Firefox, and DuckDuckGo is another option that has optional AI features but allows you to turn off all of the AI.
So we have a question in the chat. Is it true that Google is training their AI on contents of emails, documents, sheets, searches, etc.? Do you happen to know?
I haven't researched that, so I don't have the answer to that. It would not be surprising to me at all. But I can't say with certainty.
Sure,
Um,
thank you.
yeah. And that's the presentation that I have for today. Yeah, if anyone has more questions, or also just wants to add anything to this conversation, um, I would love to hear additional tools that people are working with related to this.